Two teams ran the same blood sample through two different pipelines, and they got two different ancestries back. Not an error in the lab, not a contamination flag. The maternal line came back pointing toward Taiwan, clean and consistent, matching thousands of other results in the region. The paternal line, from the same person in the same sample, came back pointing somewhere else entirely, toward the islands of near Oceania, thousands of kilometers off the expected route. The technicians checked the machines. They checked the reagents. They ran it again. The second run matched the first. Whatever this discrepancy was, it wasn't a mistake. It was a signal. The population carrying this contradiction has one of the most complete, most confidently told origin stories in the Pacific. For generations, researchers have traced it as a single, elegant migration. A people who left Taiwan roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, moved south through island Southeast Asia, pushed east across near Oceania, and eventually reached the most remote habitable islands on Earth. The final leg of that journey brought a small number of voyagers from the Society Islands, by way of the Cook Islands, to the shores of Aotearoa, New Zealand, somewhere around 800 years ago. This is the Maori origin story as most textbooks tell it. It is not a myth invented to flatter anyone. It is built on decades of linguistic, archaeological, and genetic evidence, and on that evidence, it holds up. The language connects cleanly to other Austronesian tongues stretching back to Taiwan. The material culture, the tools, the boat-building techniques, the crop varieties, traces the same root. For a long time, this was treated as a closed case. One people, one direction. One long, unbroken thread pulled taut across an ocean. Here is where it gets complicated. That thread only stays unbroken if you're only looking at half of it. Human ancestry isn't carried in one continuous strand, it's carried in two, running in parallel through every generation. One is mitochondrial DNA, passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation. Think of it as a surname inherited only through the maternal side, a label copied forward with almost no alteration for tens of thousands of years. The other is the Y chromosome, passed from father to son the same way, a parallel surname, tracking the paternal line instead. In most well-documented migrations, these two threads roughly agree with each other. They tell the same story from two different angles. In this population, they don't. Researchers studying complete mitochondrial genomes from a group of unadmixed Maori individuals found something remarkably consistent. Nearly all of it sat within a single genetic lineage, known as haplogroup B4A1A1, a lineage so dominant across Polynesia that it accounts for more than 90% of all Polynesian mitochondrial signatures recorded. Later, broader analysis across the wider Polynesian population, carried out by researchers including Manfred Kaiser, working out of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and Erasmus University Medical Center Rotterdam, quantified it precisely. Roughly 94% of Polynesian mitochondrial DNA traces to East Asia. Clean, expected, exactly what the settled story predicts. Then they looked at the Y chromosome, and the number flipped almost entirely. Across Polynesia, roughly 66% of Y chromosomes trace not to Asia, but to Melanesia, a genetically and geographically distinct set of populations from near Oceania. In Maori specifically, over half, 52%, carry a Melanesian-linked paternal lineage known as C2A1-P33. The mothers say Asia, the fathers say somewhere else. Not by a small margin, not by years, by centuries, and by an entirely different starting point on the map. Kaiser's own team described this as one of the most dramatic examples of maternal-paternal disagreement ever documented in human population genetics. That's not casual language. That's a research team telling you, in careful academic phrasing, that they didn't expect this either. So which line is telling the truth? That's the wrong question, and it took researchers a while to admit it. The right question is what happened to produce two truths at once. The first theory, and the one with the longest research history behind it, is known as the slow boat model. It proposes that Polynesian ancestors did originate in East Asia, exactly as the settled story says, but the journey wasn't a straight, uninterrupted push eastward. Instead, these early voyagers spent an extended period settled among Melanesian populations in near Oceania. generations, not seasons, mixing extensively before continuing on toward the remote Pacific. Under this model, the Melanesian paternal signature isn't a contradiction of the Taiwan origin story. It's an addition to it, folded in somewhere along a much longer, much slower route than anyone originally assumed. The evidence for extensive mixing is strong. The 66% figure is hard to explain any other way. But the model has a limitation researchers are careful to name. It explains that the mixing happened. It struggles to explain why it happened so unevenly. If two populations mixed extensively over generations, why would the maternal and paternal lines diverge this sharply instead of blending towards something more balanced on both sides? The second theory tries to answer that exact gap. This is the sex-biased admixture model, and it shifts the explanation away from geography and towards social structure. Many early Austronesian-speaking communities appear to have practiced matrilocal residence, a system where husbands moved into their wives' communities rather than the reverse. Under this framework, Melanesian men marrying into Austronesian-speaking matrilocal communities would have their paternal lineage absorbed into the group over time, while the maternal lineage, already dominant, already the social anchor of the household, remained essentially undisturbed. Supporting data comes from autosomal studies of related Polynesian populations in Samoa and Tonga, where researchers found roughly 65 to 76% Southeast Asian ancestry alongside 24 to 35% Melanesian ancestry across the wider genome, a split that lines up with the uneven maternal-paternal pattern rather than contradicting it. This is the part the records don't explain, though. Exactly when, exactly where, and how many separate contact events this involved. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty, a mechanism that fits the pattern, not a documented event anyone witnessed or recorded. The first theory says the mixing happened along the migration route. The second says it happened because of who lived where and who married in. The third, and this is the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud without qualification, pushes the timeline itself into question. Ancient mitogenome sequencing from populations in and around the Bismarck Archipelago in near Oceania has turned up a genetic lineage estimated to be around 6,000 years old, a lineage that predates the entire Austronesian expansion by roughly 3 millennia. That means some of the ancestral threads eventually absorbed into Polynesian populations may not trace back to Asia at all, at any point. They may trace back to a population that was already established in near Oceania long before anyone left Taiwan. The data doesn't confirm this, it only fails to rule it out. No serious researcher is claiming Maori ancestry is somehow older than the Austronesian migration in some triumphant, headline-ready sense. What they're saying is more unsettling in a quieter way. The tidy, single origin story might be missing an entire population's worth of deep, pre-existing ancestry, folded so thoroughly into the historical record that it left almost no trace except this one genetic echo. Imagine standing on the deck of a double-hulled waka, somewhere off the coast of a near-Oceanian island whose name won't appear in any Polynesian oral history passed down to today. It's night. The air smells of salt, crushed pandanus leaf, and the faint rot of stored breadfruit lashed below deck. Above you, a navigator who has never seen a written star chart is tracking a swell pattern with his palm flat against the hull, reading the ocean the way another person might read a page. Some of the crew speak a dialect that traces back to Taiwan by way of 1,000 small islands. Others speak something older, rooted in near Oceania, learned from grandparents who never left this stretch of water. Tonight, those two lineages are sharing water rations and a compass made of memory. Neither one knows they are about to become inseparable in the bodies of everyone descended from this voyage. The ocean ahead is dark in every direction. There is no shoreline to aim for yet, just a heading and trust. Here is where the story stops being simple and starts being something else. For a long time, the Melanesian paternal signature in Polynesian and Maori genomes has been framed, even in careful academic writing, as a complication, a wrinkle in an otherwise clean Asian origin story, something to be explained away rather than credited. But flip the framing and the same data tells a different story. Long-distance Pacific voyaging wasn't accomplished by one culturally homogeneous group pushing blindly into open ocean. It required accumulated maritime knowledge, navigation techniques, boat-building adaptations, and intimate understanding of currents and swells that near-oceanian populations had been refining for thousands of years before any Austronesian speaker arrived. The incorporation of Melanesian lineage into the ancestors of Polynesians, and eventually Maori, may not represent dilution of an original identity. It may represent the very mechanism that made the later stages of the migration survivable at all. The DNA, some once treated as a footnote to the real origin story, may actually be recording the moment the voyage became possible. There's a second layer to this reframing, and it's easy to miss because it hides in a number people skim past too quickly. 800 years. That's roughly how long Maori have been in Aotearoa, genetically. A remarkably short window. Not an ancient, isolated population unchanged since the deep past, the way certain popular narratives like to frame indigenous origin stories for dramatic effect. A young population, by genetic standards, still carrying, clearly, measurably, the fingerprints of at least two ancestral populations that met, mixed, and voyaged together within a genealogically recent and traceable span. One researcher working on early Maori genomic samples described the moment of first seeing the Y chromosome data laid against the mitochondrial data as feeling less like solving a puzzle and more like discovering the puzzle had two separate boxes of pieces mixed together the whole time. That's not a quote from Triumph. That's a quote from someone recalibrating what they thought they already understood. Every population carries this same layered structure somewhere in its genome, if you look with enough resolution. No lineage is a single clean thread pulled straight back to one point of origin. Every ancestry is closer to a woven cord, multiple strands, different sources, twisted together tightly enough to look, from a distance, like one continuous line. The maternal and paternal discordance in Maori genomes isn't an anomaly limited to one small population at the edge of the Pacific. It's a magnified, unusually well-documented example of something true of nearly everyone, everywhere, if the data existed to show it as clearly. The mystery here was never really about where Maori came from. Both threads answer that question, just from different directions, at different times, through different people. The real mystery is what it means for identity itself when the origin isn't a point on a map at all, but a knot. Two ropes pulled from opposite shorelines, tied together somewhere in the dark, in open water, by people who had no way of knowing what they were founding. The Maori were never who the simple version of the story said they were. They were something more complicated, more layered, and considerably more remarkable than one clean migration route could ever have accounted for. And the knot, as far as the data can tell, is still not fully untied.